Welcome to Americana Archives. Today we have part 3 of the story with the headline, Indian War History, with the subheadline, Reminiscences of Old Strike the Ree, Old Dakota, and their contemporaries in the early part of the present century. This article was written by Creep Easy of Calamity Farm. It says, in the meantime, Strike the Ree and his war party of Yankton Indians lay concealed in their secluded camp on the banks of the Cannonball River until the wounds of Crazy Bull had healed sufficiently to allow him to travel. But before his wounds were entirely healed, a heavy rain set in, which lasted several days, causing the water of the river to rise so fast that it soon flooded the low bottomlands and made it necessary for them to move from their secluded location and seek higher ground. Reaching an elevated and isolated spot in the neighborhood, they ensconced themselves, disposed of everything as securely as possible, and passed the night without molestation. Early next morning, while reconnoitering the surroundings of their new location, they observed to their disquiet a cloud of smoke rising from the base of the hill below them, which, upon investigation, proved to be from the campfires of a large band of Arakiris that were encamped on the plain below. This tribe and the Yanktons were at deadly feud at the time, on account of old grievances, and were bold enemies, fond of hazardous exploits. Wishing to evade the vigilance of this band of hostile foes, who were too numerous to encounter, Strike the Ree and his party succeeded in reaching the banks of the Cannonball during the succeeding night, and after constructing a bull boat made from buffalo hides stretched on a light frame, they launched it and passed out through the mouth of the Cannonball into the broad bosom of the Missouri, and continued underway until they had passed the larger encampment of their enemies. Considering that they were beyond all danger, they pulled ashore. After a brief pause, Strike the Ree and 10 of his companions rose, and assuming their arms, wended their way to the water's edge. All save 2 drew the boat from its concealment in the willows, into which the party entered, and as the first ray of morning illuminated the vast expanse of water, they silently took their way across the stream, in the way of the Arakiri encampment. The warriors that remained were the younger and favorite brother of Strike the Ree and the wounded Indian Crazy Bull. On ordinary occasions, the brothers would not have parted without affectionate words, but they were now on the warpath, when naught save the prosecution of their fierce designs of hatred and revenge could be permitted to enter into their thoughts, or at all events into the expression of them. The younger brother, a fine-looking fellow, rose soon after the main party had left, and leaving the wounded Indian reclining on a buffalo robe, walked a short distance back from the bank of the river to a rising piece of ground to reconnoiter. This rash act cost him his life. The wounded Indian rose, and standing upright, his wounds rendering his motion slow, peered cautiously in the direction that the young brave had taken. His glance was at first careless, and more from habit than necessity for caution. But suddenly his eye rested on something which claimed his attention for a second. It was, however, but for a second. And then, as if he had seen nothing, he kept turning round in his gradual survey. On rising, he had resumed his bow, and scarcely had he been startled by the object which had interrupted the even tenor of his examination, when he sent an arrow on its flight in the direction of a cluster of bushes to the left of where the young Yankton brave stood. Another arrow crossed it on its way, and entered the side of the Yankton warrior. 2 Arakiri warriors rose from behind the bushes at the same moment, one in the last struggles of death. The brother of Strike the Ree grasped his lance, though scarcely able to stand, and a grim smile of satisfaction crossed his visage as he saw one of the enemy fall from the effects of Crazy Bull's arrow. The next instant, each giving the fearful war whoop of his native tribe, the Yankton brave and the remaining Arakiri warrior were in close engagement. The contest was of short duration, the young Yankton brave being mortally wounded by the arrow. The Arakiri soon plunged his spear into the body of his enemy, and to scalp both friend and foe, lest the locks of the former should fall into the hands of his detested enemies, was the work of an instant. Mounting a fleet horse which stood concealed in the thicket, the victor bounded a headlong pace up the valley in the direction of the Arakiri encampment, well knowing that the war whoop would bring back Strike the Ree and his companions upon him. A few minutes sufficed for the return of Strike the Ree and his comrades to the side of his relative, who, though death had almost overtaken him, still had strength enough to call upon his brother and his friends for vengeance with his last breath. Strike the Ree, as soon as life had departed from his brother, drew forth the reeking spear and carefully examined it with expressions of sorrow, fierce boiling revenge, and anxiety to discover the author of the deed. The spear was left sticking in the young brave's body purposely, as a challenge to the young man's relatives to avenge his death whenever the opportunity occurred. It was made of tough mountain ash, exquisitely rounded and curved. Its long blade of polished steel was two-edged and jagged, and at intervals on the shaft, by way of ornament, were attached tufts of war eagle plumes, fancifully colored. That the Arakiri wished to make himself known, or so prized an article would not have been left, was evident. Young Strike the Ree felt the challenge thus expressed, and his burning wish to discover the owner was evident in the fierce glance he bent upon it. The young braves looked on for some time in silence, when perceiving he was at fault, Crazy Bull advanced, and laying his hand on the shoulders of the young leader, uttered, in a deep guttural tone, one word of 2 syllables, 4 bears. An exclamation of surprise burst from the party, which marked a most celebrated war chief in the Arakiri tribe. Strike the Ree, satisfied with this explanation, threw away his own spear, and taking the Arakiri war spear into his possession, as an indication that he would avenge his brother's death, according to the custom of the tribe, seated himself on a buffalo robe by the side of Crazy Bull, while his companions proceeded to hastily bury the young brave. Had they been near their own village, various strange and interesting ceremonies would have been performed. But in the enemy's country, and with perhaps a fierce contest at hand, the mere letter of the traditionary law was followed out, the rites being left to be performed on their return to their native village, far down the Great Missouri. His buffalo robe was wrapped around his body, while several rawhide thongs, which served to confine it tightly about his form, was the work of only a few minutes, and after the body of the dead Arakiri warrior was mutilated and left a prey to the turkey buzzards and prairie wolves, the body of the Yankton brave was carried on board their boat, and hastily embarking, they silently took their way down the Missouri. The river was high, tempestuous, and filled with floating ice and driftwood, it being at the time of the spring flood. The weather was cold, and there were symptoms of an impending storm. They rounded the upper end of an island with difficulty as night set in, and as their bull boat, which had been constructed from 3 buffalo hides sewed together and fashioned in the shape of a boat, with seams caulked with buffalo tallow and ashes, and stretched on a light frame made from willows, began to leak, they ran ashore and camped for the night. That night they buried young Strike the Ree's brother on an elevated piece of ground, and obliterated all traces of the grave, so the enemy could not find it. They had yet to pass the lower or main Arakiri village, and as the enemy knew they were on the river and in their neighborhood, they had to try and pass it during the night, or fight their way through the enemy's country. We forbear to detail all the circumstances and adventures of the voyage, down the windings and doublings of this vast river. Suffice it to say, that ere the dawn of morning, the bull boat emerged with its adventurous crew into the broad expanse of the mighty Missouri, and with muffled oars, the war party glided down the river, keeping close under the shore opposite to the Indian village, watching its various lodges and smoldering campfires. The dogs of the village perceived them, and kept up an incessant barking, but the Indians fortunately took no notice of them. They continued under way till beyond all danger from their enemies. In vain did Strike the Ree urge them to remain in the neighborhood until they could get an opportunity to avenge his brother's death. The majority decided to return to their native village, now that their vow had been fulfilled. After he failed to prevail upon them to stay with him, Strike the Ree decided to leave them and work his way back alone, and deal with Four Bears, the slayer of his brother, on his own account. The Indian warrior, who knew his road well, turned his back upon his companions, who continued on their course down the river in the bull boat and walked ashore. In his hand was the fatal Arakiri war spear. By his side was his knife, his bow and quiver, which with his pipe and a small package of buffalo meat constituted his whole outfit. Bidding his comrades adieu, he sallied forth. Ere the first gray of dawn had crept to the extreme eastern verge of the horizon, he had started on his perilous journey, and was soon lost to the sight of his companions, mingling to all appearances with the distant brown of the opposite bluffs. To be continued. Tune back in soon for part 4 of this incredible story. This story came from the great state of South Dakota, being reported in the Daily Press and Dakotaian of August 27, 1888. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.